Hello and welcome to Murder with Friends, the show where two friends get together and talk about the darker sides of history. I'm your host, Grace Baldridge, and joining me today for a special What Have We Learned episode is Amir, my co-creator and producer of this show. This is the second to last taping that we will be doing for this season of Murder with Friends. So I thought it was as good a time as any for us to just sit down and go over some of the basics, some cases that we've covered, but also sort of break down what was a serial killer before we had the term for serial killers, how was profiling established, and how those trends continued into the late 20th and 21st century. So there is a lot to get into, but I figure we can just sort of jump into it.
Right.
Basically, well, I mean, let's just go to our first video element. This will touch off our conversation, which is what was a serial killer before we knew what a serial killer was?
What was a serial killer before a serial killer? A mass murderer? A spree killer? These terms don't quite fit. In the popular Netflix show Mindhunter, Bill Tench coins the term in a brainstorming session, seeking to differentiate the crimes of Edmund Kemper and Richard Speck. In actuality, FBI agent Robert Ressler first used the word serial killer in 1974 because the crimes he was researching reminded him of old serial adventure flicks from the 30s and 40s. He noted that each film ended on a cliffhanger. There was an urgency for viewers to come back and find resolution. He imagined that sense of urgency must be tenfold in the minds of killers stuck in a serial cycle to complete their perfect crime. The term wouldn't reach the mainstream media until 6 years later, but the in-depth analysis into the psyche of murderers had begun. The cases that shaped the behavioral analysis unit and the evolution of crime in the late 20th century. Today on Murder with Friends.
So there you have it. That's basically what we're going to be talking about on today's episode. Now, criminal profiling seems sort of like a recent phenomenon, but actually it's been in existence for some time. In fact, if you watch our episode on Jack the Ripper, you'll see that there was some rudimentary profiling going on by Dr. Phillips and Dr. Bond when they were just examining the crime scene. But it wasn't really a widely accepted science, and it certainly wasn't put into its own unit until like the 1970s. We saw that there was a Howard Tetton and Patrick Mullaney were basically the inspirations behind Mindhunter. They were these group of FBI agents, and they would go around teaching different police departments how you could profile a killer. But it wasn't until Robert Ressler came along in 1972 where he founded the BSU. He started conducting interviews with these killers. So Mindhunter is sort of a combination of those things. They made this basis because of certain cases that they were able to crack using successful criminal profiling. So let's talk about some of those cases, Amir. What are some of the ones that come to mind?
Right, so let me take it back a little bit to kind of like give some context for how the FBI kind of formed. So in the 20s and 30s, the FBI was just taking hold to take down a lot of like the different criminal organizations that were going on there that we all know about, like the mafia and those things. So that was kind of a period of, there was no like psychological analytics going on criminals. It was more of just like a good guy, bad guy type of thing. But after World War II is when you really start seeing these kinds of things happen. And one of the earliest cases where, in America at least, where profiling was used was in the case of the Mad Bomber.
Yeah, right. George Metzke.
George Metzke. And he was, when we were talking about it before this show, he was kind of like a classic Batman comic book villain. He was fired from his job after getting a pretty bad job-related injury, and he was really bitter about that. So he started planting bombs around the city.
For years and years.
For years. He actually took a break during World War II because he was such a patriot. And he's like, out of my love for this country, I'm gonna take a break, but justice will be served to this company.
Yeah.
And after World War II ended, then he started planting bombs again, and he didn't kill anyone, but he planted around over 30 bombs and he injured a bunch of people.
Yeah.
And by the end of it, the New York police were like, we need to figure out who this guy is. And they brought a criminal psychologist at that point who helped profile.
I think at that time he was just characterized, or he was qualified as just a psychologist, because I think criminal psychology was just sort of starting to take any momentum.
Right.
But they brought in the psychologist who was able to profile George Metsky, I mean, down to the minute details of his relationship status, who he would hang out with.
Yeah, it was actually at the same time, like it was a little oddly too specific, where like this man will be wearing a double-breasted suit.
Right.
Where it's like, come on, you can't really figure those things out. But
you
those details aside, though, like everything else was pretty spot on. Like he said, like this is a foreign-born man who lives with 2 women.
Right.
That are also single, and like they found out that like he actually did live with his 2 unmarried sisters.
Well, you can find so much in the details of someone's writing. I think of the cases that we've covered, like John List and the Zodiac on this show, where especially in the case of John List, now this is years and years later, they were able to bring in a forensic psychologist, a criminal psychologist, and then also like a sculptor. They brought in this whole team that worked on this, and they were able to predict his thick-brimmed glasses. That's the sort of detail that sounds so crazy and ludicrous until you actually see it work out from what they're able to glean from someone's writings and from the belongings that they have around their house and who they associate with. But in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, it was just starting to take hold that perhaps this is the sort of science that the FBI should be investing in.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until 1972 that the BSU, Behavioral Science Unit, was formed. Now it's called the Behavioral Analysis Unit. But it wasn't until significantly after that people were able to concretely prove that profiling, criminal profiling, is successful and can lead to the apprehension of murderers. There was another case that was headed by Howard Tedden and Patrick Mullaney, who again are pretty much the inspirations behind Mindhunter, I would say. And they apprehended David Hoffer, who was, I believe, found guilty of 4 murders.
Yeah.
And this was sort of a roundabout, loop-de-loop way of apprehending him, because they felt that he fit the profile for the murder of this woman, this 19-year-old woman. And they brought him in, and he was so well put together and so articulate that he was able to get off. He passed a lie detector test, even under truth serum.
Right, so he did not fit the initial profile that they had of who would commit this crime. They thought it was like some unkempt man that wasn't very intelligent.
But their suspicions were raised, though.
Yeah.
Like even when they brought him in
because,
and he was able to pass all this stuff, they still were like, there's something about this guy that fits.
The main thing was that he was military trained. He was a Vietnam vet.
Right.
So they're like, based on that, they were still convinced, even though he was pretty articulate, charismatic, and educated, that he still had to have been the only person that could have done this. Yeah,
that he would have the skill set to slash into a tent with the particular type of knife that was used to grab this woman, and they ended up being right, although it would take years for that to prove to be true, and it ended up being kind of a slow burn. But that was another major success story in criminal profiling, because they were able to point to, we sat down, we talked to this guy, we flagged him for the following reasons, and we were able to show in time that this profile was accurate.
And
that it
they
does hold up.
their actions, I would argue, led Amir Hoffer to self-incriminate himself eventually, because just like out of his own pride or cockiness, but by singling him out the way they did, it eventually led him to kind of make a mistake.
Yeah, they kept the pressure on.
Yeah.
So eventually, finally, they start compiling their research, and the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program is an initiative that is put into place. And through this, we learn a whole bunch about what are the typical characteristics that you find within a serial killer. And a lot of this stuff is sort of like what Christine said in our episode on Richard Ramirez. It's like serial killer bingo. I'm gonna read you some of the characteristics that they found from their research, and it applies to so many people we've covered on this show. So their motivation is usually psychological gratification of some sort, sex, anger, thrill, gain, or simply attention. They often suffer from mental illness or psychotic breaks. They lack remorse or guilt and project blame on their victims. They have a compulsive need for power and control. They exhibit impulsivity and predatory behavior. They often wear a mask of sanity in public for protective coloration. Their boundaries between fantasy and reality are lost. Their fantasies turn to dominance, control, sexual conquest, violence, and finally, murder, and that many of them would suffer from antisocial personality disorder. And so much of that, it's crazy to think that that was at one point in time groundbreaking, because now it feels like an understood, foregone conclusion when looking at a serial killer that that's the list you want to start checking off.
Right.
They found even more stuff when it comes to their background, and this is again something that now we sort of take for granted whenever we talk about these sorts of things. A lot of times on this show, like when we were talking about Jeffrey Dahmer, I'll say something like, well, you know, he surprisingly didn't hurt animals, but for a time that wasn't ever correlated to serial killers. This is again what they learned. They had a history of being bullied or socially isolated as children and adolescents. They often engaged in petty crimes like theft, fraud, or vandalism. They are compulsive and practiced liars. Many come from unstable families and have experienced a serious family disruption. Many serial killers have a history of being abused emotionally, physically, and or sexually in their youth. They frequently manifest attachment disorder due to early childhood trauma like violence, neglect, rejection, or pervasive alcohol or drug use in the home. They suffer from low self-esteem and retreat into a fantasy world where they are safe and in control. They show a fascination with fire starting.
Pyromania.
Yeah, they show cruelty to younger children and or small animals.
Yeah, so these are all things that we kind of like collectively as a society we know now of like what makes a killer, but like at this point, like they had no idea. They didn't even like consider thinking about these things. And like they kind of touch on it in Mindhunter, where there was just this general revulsion into like looking into these different aspects of humanizing like these killers.
Well, and that's where
they just want to. These people are evil. Like, why do we need to get into their head and think like the way they think?
Yeah.
That's terrible. That's disgusting. But
yeah, they're depraved people. They have, you know, they have deviant behavior. So
Right.
why even give them the time of day? Most people don't act this way.
Yeah.
You know, serial killers are, you know, a fraction of American society. If you haven't noticed, we're focusing our discussion today on American killers, and yeah, so why even give them the time of day? So it was really very groundbreaking when Robert Ressler sat down with Edmund Kemper, who we've also done an episode on, and gotten his point of view on, okay, why do you kill? What is your motivation? And Edmund Kemper was sort of a unique example of a very cogent killer. He was able to very like precisely describe what his motivations were, the sort of gratification that he felt, and it didn't really seem like he had too much of an agenda with Robert Ressler, which is interesting because Ressler has also commented on the interviews that he has done with Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy, and he has said that those were two killers that he felt were trying to get in his head, and Edmund Kemper was just sort of, I'm an open book, I'm a serial killer, that's just how it is, this is why I killed, this is
Right.
how I feel about my mother and how that played into my murderous fantasies, here you go.
he was super helpful in all of this, the study behind all of this. And now, was he an organized serial killer or was he disorganized serial killer?
That's a really interesting question, because that differentiation was something I hadn't really researched before. He's got to be organized, because think about it. He's driving around in his car. He has all the tools in there with him. He knows, he like plans basically his day around killing. He wasn't sort of like Ted Bundy towards the end of his spree, who got really messy and was just sort of driving around looking for someone that ultimately didn't fit his previous MO of victims.
Right. So
Edmund
Bundy,
Kemper had like
though,
a
he was
specific
kind
plan.
of both, right? He started out organized, but like near the end, he became more and more disorganized.
Ted Bundy is a really
He was like a hybrid
exceptional
of
case.
the two, yeah.
Specifically when it comes to the behavioral science unit and how it evolved, because he is often cited as one of the cases that established criminal profiling as a legitimate cornerstone to any investigation. We will be talking about Ted Bundy, spoiler alert. It's not this episode, but it's coming up, so put it together given that this is the second to last taping.
Yeah. But
so
the importance of Ted Bundy was that
huge.
Yeah, it was the first one that Ressler was an active case where they could actually apply.
I'm not
these
sure if it
teachings.
was the first one, but it was certainly the first high-profile case, because Ted Bundy was apprehended. He was behind bars, and he escaped from captivity.
In Colorado, I think.
We'll have a pop-up on exactly where.
Okay.
But basically he escaped and he was on the loose,
Yeah.
he was on the lam, and they were able to put together a really comprehensive profile for women and also for law enforcement in the area of what to stay away from for the women, because they knew exactly what his type of victim was. And also,
don't part your hair down the middle.
for law enforcement, they were able to tell them, this is where you guys need to be, because this guy has a killing compulsion. He will do it again. He knows how to get away with it, but we now have the research behind it to know exactly how he's going to do it, or at least how he's going to attempt to do it. And so that actually led to him being apprehended again. And that was a huge win for criminal profiling, because they were able to put out such a detailed report on what they needed to look for. Where previously, like, imagine if Ted Bundy had gotten loose in, I don't know, let's say like 1930s or something. It would have just been hope for the best. You know, law enforcement is doing what they can, stay away from this guy.
It would, but there are other factors that, like, we didn't really talk about this, but I kind of wanted to bring it up.
Yeah.
And like, these are different, perhaps, theories you could say as to why you have this supposed increase in serial killers in the 60s and 70s. So like, you're saying if Ted Bundy was in the 30s, would he have been a more effective killer or not?
Would he been able to have gotten away with it, is what
Would
I'm
he have
saying.
been able to Yeah, I would probably argue yes. At the same time, there's some factors such as there was no highway system back then, which some people point to as being a main reason why there is like so many serial killers in the 60s and 70s, when they built this national highway system where people were just moving around a lot more. So you have like people from random places that wouldn't have left their regions now over in the Bay Area of California, where there was a lot of serial killers at some point.
No, that's a huge point to bring up, because a big thing that happened with the foundation of the BSU was that they were able to track and keep tabs on nomadic killers, whereas previously departments really weren't able to communicate with each other, or it just wasn't really a big consideration. It's in part why the Zodiac was able to move so freely in between different counties. You know, and especially the Zodiac is a very particular case because his MO changed significantly from murder to murder. But you know, departments just weren't communicating with each other, so they didn't necessarily know if there was a serial killer. But when Robert Ressler was able to step in and say, here's the deal, we need to compile more of a database for these serial offenders, otherwise we'll just never know. It's just sort of a mystery. And that was another win in the case of Ted Bundy, because you had this guy that was moving around, and that in another decade, well, it would have been harder for him to have moved around, but it also would have been incredibly difficult for departments to even put together that they had a serial killer.
Right.
Now you have all this information going to one central location, and then they can compile a detailed profile on this person. And so it's sort of like, we got you, bitch. Like, that's really like what it feels like when they founded this unit, and that's where the research sort of tapped in. That was really like its heyday was in between like the 1970s to like the cusp of the 1990s. And if you don't circle around true crime circles, which perhaps you do because you're watching the show, you might have thought that that trend in serial killers has really mostly subsided and serial killers are a thing of the past. Now, what we're going to get into in part 2 is that that's just simply untrue. There are serial killers that are alive and well and active today, but then there's also another trend that we've seen on the uptick. We're going to talk about the trend in spree killing and mass shootings, and what is the research today on that? Stay with us.